What if the only way to save your mother was to ask a complete stranger to marry her? This isn't a love story in the way we usually picture one. It's a story about fear, the kind that hides behind polite smiles and closed doors. It's about a little girl who saw more than she should have. The aroma of freshly ground coffee hung in the air like a warm blanket, mixing with the sweet smell of cinnamon and butter. The cafe, a cozy little spot nestled between an old bookstore and a flower shop, buzzed gently with quiet conversation and the soft hiss of steaming milk. It was the kind of place people came to slow down, to remember how to breathe. David Caldwell sat alone at his usual table by the window, where the morning light filtered through aged glass, casting golden streaks across his open tablet. He wore a navy wool blazer and leather shoes polished to a perfect shine. His tie was still neatly knotted even though it was Saturday. Even in moments of rest, David clung to structure, the familiar scaffolding of routine that kept the chaos at bay. He took a sip of his espresso, strong, unsweetened, and adjusted the volume on his earbuds, though no music was playing. It was just habit, a form of control. Then it happened. "Excuse me, sir, can you marry my mom?" The voice was small, incredibly small, but it silenced the whole cafe. David looked up, startled. A little girl was standing in front of him. Her hair was tied into two uneven braids, her coat a size too big, frayed at the sleeves. Her sneakers were scuffed canvas, probably once pink, now faded by time and pavement. And her eyes were clear and direct. Hazel. Steady. Like she'd rehearsed this moment in her head 100 times. He blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" The girl didn't back down. She stepped closer, chin lifted. "I said, can you marry my mom, please?" At the counter, a coffee cup slipped from someone's hand and hit the floor with a dull thud. A few heads turned. One barista stopped mid-pour. Behind the girl, a woman froze, eyes wide, face pale. "Lily," the woman said, her voice trembling, "what are you doing?" The girl, Lillian, didn't turn around. "He looks nice, Mom. He looks safe." The woman rushed forward and placed her hands on Lily's shoulders. Her dark hair was pulled into a messy bun, loose strands falling around her face. Her clothes were clean but worn, secondhand, carefully chosen. She was beautiful in a way that couldn't be bought, but her face showed signs of deep exhaustion. Not just the kind sleep could fix. The kind that comes from living in fear. "I'm so sorry," she whispered to David, gently pulling Lily back. We've had a tough week and she's confused. Please don't." "I'm not confused," Lily said, louder now. "Richard yelled at her again last night. He threw the plate. It broke. He said if she left him, he'd call the police." The cafe froze. Sarah, her name was Sarah, David would learn later, brought a hand to her mouth, eyes filled with tears. She crouched next to Lily, her voice shaking. "You can't say things like that in front of strangers. Come on, baby, please." "But he is a stranger," Lily said. "That's why it's okay to ask. Maybe a stranger is better than someone we already know." A heavy silence fell. David didn't sleep that night. He tried. He went through his usual routine, a glass of water, ambient playlist, bedroom set to exactly 68 degrees. But no amount of control could quiet what was already echoing loudly inside him. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the little girl's voice looping endlessly in his mind. "So we don't have to hide anymore. Richard said he'll tell immigration." It felt cruel, how such heavy, terrifying truths could come from such a small voice. By morning, the restlessness had only grown. He sat at the edge of his bed, elbows on his knees, trying to convince himself to let it go. He didn't even know their last name. Maybe it wasn't his place. Maybe it was just a strange encounter, the kind of thing people retell at dinner parties as an odd city story. But it hadn't felt like a story. It had felt like a warning. Back at the cafe, people were still talking about it. The barista who witnessed it all told his manager it was kind of sweet, but also terrifying. A young couple who had been sitting nearby posted about it on social media, a short, vague caption with a hint of disbelief. "Kid asked a stranger to marry her mom to save her from some bad guy. Wild morning. Only in the city." Nobody laughed in the comments. The tone was too raw. Reactions were mixed. One woman wrote, "Parents shouldn't drag their kids into adult drama." Someone else replied, That little girl may have saved her mother's life. Don't judge what you don't understand. It wasn't just a moment. It had become a ripple. Meanwhile, Sarah and Lily had found temporary shelter at a church-run refuge downtown. A narrow building with borrowed blankets, donated meals, and privacy curtains that barely hung. Sarah had barely spoken since they arrived. She just sat on the edge of a metal-framed bunk staring down at her hands. They were still red and raw from scrubbing dishes at the diner the night before. Lily sat cross-legged on the mattress, holding her worn-out backpack close. Inside were a few colored pencils, 2 storybooks, and a photo of her with her real dad. A man who had died when she was only 4, but whose smile she still remembered clearly. "Are you mad at me?" Lily asked softly. Sarah looked at her. "Why would I be mad?" "Because I asked him, the man from the cafe." Sarah let out a long, shaky breath. Her voice cracked. "I'm not mad, I'm just scared. What you said, it was true. But the way it came out, I didn't know what else to do," Lily whispered. "No one helps us, and you always say nice people are out there." He looked like one. Sarah didn't answer. She pulled Lily into her arms and held her, not tightly but like someone trying to anchor themselves in a storm. Somewhere else in the city, David tried to push it all out of his mind. He threw himself into meetings, emails, a business lunch with potential investors. But nothing stuck. Numbers blurred. Conversations floated past him. In the middle of a boardroom presentation, he turned to a colleague and asked out of nowhere, "Have you ever met someone who just looked lost, but not because of something they did wrong? Just because life knocked them down one too many times?" The room fell quiet. The colleague gave a half laugh. "David, you okay?" He nodded quickly. "Yeah, sorry, just thinking about something else." But it wasn't something else. That evening he walked back to the cafe. He didn't know exactly what he was hoping for. Maybe a clue, a trace, some small sign they'd been real. A napkin with a phone number, a message left behind. But of course, there was nothing. Just the same soft jazz playing overhead, and a waitress who asked, "The usual?" He nodded and sat by the window again but didn't touch his coffee. He just watched the street searching for 2 familiar faces in the crowd, wondering where they were now, who they were running from, and what he could have, should have, done differently. That's when something shifted. The next morning, he told his assistant to cancel all non-essential meetings. "I need the afternoon," he said. "For what?" she asked. But he didn't answer. Instead, he opened his laptop and typed into the search bar. By then, Lily's words had left their mark, not just on David, but on everyone who had witnessed that moment. Some couldn't stop thinking about how brave she'd been. Others debated whether it had all been staged. But most people agreed on one thing. There was something deeply real in that child's voice. Unfiltered, honest, brave in that innocent, heartbreaking way children can be. Because they haven't yet learned that the world isn't always fair. Sarah, meanwhile, was overwhelmed with guilt, not because of what Lily had said, but because of what it revealed. That her daughter had become the protector. That she herself had become so used to surviving, she'd forgotten how to ask for rescue. "I didn't want her to know how bad things were," she told a shelter volunteer. "But she sees everything." "She's not trying to shame you," the woman replied gently. "She's trying to save you." That night, as Lily drifted off to sleep under a faded quilt, Sarah stayed awake. She cried, quietly, shoulders trembling, not because of what Lily had done, but because of what she hadn't. She had forgotten how to ask for help. And yet somehow her daughter hadn't. David didn't sleep that night. He tried. He went through his usual routine. A glass of water, ambient playlist, bedroom set to exactly 68 degrees. But no amount of control could quiet what was already echoing loudly inside him. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the little girl's voice looping endlessly in his mind. "So we don't have to hide anymore. Richard said he'll tell immigration." It felt cruel, how such heavy, terrifying truths could come from such a small voice. By morning, the restlessness had only grown. He sat at the edge of his bed, elbows on his knees, trying to convince himself to let it go. He didn't even know their last name. Maybe it wasn't his place. Maybe it was just a strange encounter. The kind of thing people retell at dinner parties as an odd city story. But it hadn't felt like a story. It had felt like a warning. Back at the cafe, people were still talking about it. The barista who witnessed it all told his manager it was kind of sweet but also terrifying. A young couple who had been sitting nearby posted about it on social media, a short, vague caption with a hint of disbelief. Kid asked a stranger to marry her mom to save her from some bad guy. Wild morning. Only in the city. Nobody laughed in the comments. The tone was too raw. Reactions were mixed. One woman wrote, "Parents shouldn't drag their kids into adult drama." Someone else replied, "That little girl may have saved her mother's life. Don't judge what you don't understand." It wasn't just a moment. It had become a ripple. Meanwhile, Sarah and Lily had found temporary shelter at a church-run refuge downtown, a narrow building with borrowed blankets, donated meals, and privacy curtains that barely hung. Sarah had barely spoken since they arrived. She just sat on the edge of a metal-framed bunk, staring down at her hands. They were still red and raw from scrubbing dishes at the diner the night before. Lily sat cross-legged on the mattress, holding her worn-out backpack close. Inside were a few colored pencils, 2 storybooks, and a photo of her with her real dad, a man who had died when she was only 4, but whose smile she still remembered clearly. "Are you mad at me?" Lily asked softly. Sarah looked at her. "Why would I be mad?" "Because I asked him, the man from the cafe." Sarah let out a long, shaky breath. Her voice cracked. "I'm not mad. I'm just, scared." "What you said, it was true, but the way it came out, I didn't know what else to do," Lily whispered. "No one helps us, and you always say nice people are out there. He looked like one." Sarah didn't answer. She pulled Lily into her arms and held her, not tightly but like someone trying to anchor themselves in a storm. Somewhere else in the city, David tried to push it all out of his mind. He threw himself into meetings, emails, a business lunch with potential investors. But nothing stuck. Numbers blurred. Conversations floated past him. In the middle of a boardroom presentation, he turned to a colleague and asked out of nowhere, "Have you ever met someone who just looked lost, but not because of something they did wrong? Just because life knocked them down one too many times?" The room fell quiet. The colleague gave a half laugh. "David, you okay?" He nodded quickly. "Yeah, sorry, just thinking about something else." But it wasn't something else. That evening, he walked back to the cafe. He didn't know exactly what he was hoping for. Maybe a clue, a trace, some small sign they'd been real. A napkin with a phone number, a message left behind. But of course, there was nothing. Just the same soft jazz playing overhead, and a waitress who asked, "The usual?" He nodded and sat by the window again but didn't touch his coffee. He just watched the street, searching for 2 familiar faces in the crowd, wondering where they were now, who they were running from, and what he could have, should have, done differently. That's when something shifted. The next morning, he told his assistant to cancel all non-essential meetings. "I need the afternoon," he said. "For what?" she asked. But he didn't answer. Instead, he opened his laptop and typed into the search bar. By then, Lily's words had left their mark, not just on David, but on everyone who had witnessed that moment. Some couldn't stop thinking about how brave she'd been. Others debated whether it had all been staged. But most people agreed on one thing. There was something deeply real in that child's voice, unfiltered, honest, brave in that innocent, heartbreaking way children can be, because they haven't yet learned that the world isn't always fair. Sarah, meanwhile, was overwhelmed with guilt, not because of what Lily had said, but because of what it revealed. That her daughter had become the protector, that she herself had become so used to surviving, she'd forgotten how to ask for rescue. "I didn't want her to know how bad things were," she told a shelter volunteer. "But she sees everything." "She's not trying to shame you," the woman replied gently. "She's trying to save you." That night, as Lily drifted off to sleep under a faded quilt, Sarah stayed awake. She cried, quietly, shoulders trembling, not because of what Lily had done, but because of what she hadn't. She had forgotten how to ask for help, and yet somehow her daughter hadn't. The walls of the shelter were too thin to hold secrets. Every cough, every whispered fear, every restless dream bled into the next cot and the next, until the entire building seemed to breathe with the weight of everyone's sorrow. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and mildew, but Sarah had stopped noticing smells a long time ago. What she couldn't ignore was how loud the silence felt. Heavy, suffocating, as if grief itself had settled deep into the floorboards. She hadn't truly slept. Not once. Sleep came in stolen fragments, always shattered by a nightmare or a door slamming too close. She would jolt upright, heart racing, half expecting to find him standing over her. But it was always just Lily, curled against her side like a kitten, her small hand still clutching the hem of Sarah's shirt. On the third morning, Sarah poured powdered milk into a chipped bowl of cereal, her hands trembling. "I like it here," Lily said quietly, chewing slowly. "The lady with the red scarf read us a story last night about a bear." Sarah gave a small nod but didn't reply. She didn't have the energy to pretend. It wasn't that Lily believed what she was saying. Sarah knew her daughter was only trying to hold her together. Lily had learned to pretend too early, learned how to read a room, how to smile when it hurt, how to soften her voice to keep grown-ups from falling apart. But children weren't meant to carry that kind of weight, especially not because of someone like Richard. "You think anyone's going to care about you, Sarah?" he had once hissed. "You and your little mistake, you're lucky I even let you stay." That was the beginning. But beginnings never stayed beginnings, they always unraveled. The last time he shoved her, it had been over a burned dinner. Lily had been in the next room. Sarah told herself it hadn't been that bad. It hadn't left a bruise. But it had left something. Something Lily had felt, even if she hadn't seen it. Then came the real threat, the one Sarah knew he meant. "If you try to leave, I'll report you. Want to explain your immigration mess to a judge with your kid watching, they'll send you both back. You'll never see her again." That fear was a cage, and for a while it worked. Until it didn't. Until Lily saw the bruises, heard the words. Until the little girl Sarah had sworn to protect decided she had to be the one protecting. Now inside this dim shelter lit by flickering bulbs, Sarah sat motionless on the edge of the cot, trying to steady her breath. Her hands were raw, cracked from hours of dishwashing at the diner job she hadn't shown up to in days. She had no phone, no address, just names scribbled on a paper she hadn't dared to call. Legal aid, emergency services, domestic violence helpline. They were just words. And words didn't mean anything if no one believed you. Her eyes fell on the old shelter landline. She reached for it, picked it up, put it down, picked it up again, and froze. The shame wrapped around her like smoke. "Can I draw here?" Lily asked, breaking the silence. Sarah turned, startled, then nodded. Lily sat cross-legged on the floor and unzipped her backpack. Inside were a few broken crayons, some wrinkled coloring pages, and a photograph, one of the only things they'd managed to keep. In it, a toddler version of Lily sat on her father's shoulders. Her real father, the only man who had ever made Sarah feel truly safe. As Lily started to draw, Sarah watched the picture take shape. A house with a pointed roof, a big tree, and 3 people holding hands. A woman, a little girl, and a man. He wore glasses and had a kind smile. It wasn't Richard. It was someone else, someone gentler. "David," Lily whispered, almost like a prayer. "I think that's his name. From the cafe." Sarah's voice caught. "Baby, and we don't know him." "But he looked like someone who could help," Lily replied simply. Across the city, David was still thinking about them. He didn't know why this moment had stuck with him. He had helped people before, donated to charities, sat on non-profit boards, attended elegant galas in tuxedos. But this wasn't a number on a report. It wasn't a nameless cause. It was a child, a real child, standing in front of him asking for help in the only way she knew how. And he hadn't answered. He had frozen. Now he sat at his desk, scrolling through local shelters and support groups. He didn't even know their last name. Sarah, maybe. He had caught it when the little girl said it, but it wasn't much to go on. Still, he picked up the phone and called. The first shelter dismissed him politely. The second one hesitated. "I can't give out names," the woman said. "But I think I know who you mean. Let me just say you're not the only one who's been worried." That night, David sat in the dark. He wasn't a hero. He didn't want to be. But something about this didn't feel over. It felt unfinished. Like a page had been torn out of his life, and he couldn't stop trying to read what had been written there. Sarah's fragile calm shattered the next morning. She stepped outside to pick up a donated meal bag, canned soup, crackers, powdered juice. She didn't see him at first. But Lily did. "Mom," she whispered, "it's him. Richard." Across the street, leaning casually against the hood of a black sedan, arms crossed, just watching. The kind of watching that made your blood run cold. Sarah froze. He didn't wave, didn't shout, didn't cross the street. He just smiled. And in that smile she read everything. He knew where she was now. The food bag slipped from her hand. Cans clattered into the gutter. She didn't even look down. She grabbed Lily's hand and ran back inside the shelter. She locked herself in the bathroom and sank to the floor, hands over her mouth, trying to keep the sobs from spilling out. She had nowhere left to go. No more safe places to hide. The walls were thin, but not even they could hold in the sound of a woman breaking. David Caldwell had always been a man of logic. Numbers made sense. Schedules offered comfort. He had spent most of his adult life building things that could be tracked: profits, buildings, strategy decks. Emotion, on the other hand, was unpredictable, messy, risky. So he kept his distance from it. Until now. Until a little girl with wide hazel eyes and a voice far too brave for her age stood in front of him and made a request that cracked every carefully constructed wall he had spent years building around himself. He hadn't been able to stop thinking about it. Days had passed since that morning at the cafe, yet every time he closed his eyes he heard her voice. Every time he saw a child on the sidewalk he pictured her face. David didn't know exactly what he was doing, but he knew he couldn't do nothing. The first place he went back to was the cafe. Same time, same table. The barista greeted him as usual, but David's eyes scanned the room. The tables, the corners, the doorway. No sign of the girl, no sign of the woman. He stayed for over an hour, barely touching his coffee. What used to be a cozy space now felt tight, stifling. "Looking for someone?" the barista asked as she wiped down the table beside him. He hesitated. "A woman and her daughter. They were here the other day. The girl, she asked me something strange." The barista tilted her head. "Oh, them. Yeah, that was intense. Everyone's been talking about it. Sweet kid. But kind of heartbreaking, right? Do you know where they went?" She shook her head. "No idea. They left in a hurry. The mom seemed, I don't know, like she was trying not to be seen." David gave a small nod. "Thanks anyway." Outside, the cold bit at his skin more sharply than usual. He stood on the sidewalk, unsure where to go next. Around him, the city pulsed forward, horns blaring, conversations flowing, feet rushing past him. But David didn't move. He pulled out his phone and started searching. Domestic violence shelters near me. City Child Protection Services. How to report suspected abuse anonymously. How to help undocumented immigrant mother and child. He had no clear plan, but he had to begin somewhere. The next day, he took a step further. He reached out to an old college friend, Julia Miles, now a caseworker with the city's Family Services Department. They hadn't spoken in years, but she answered on the first ring. "David, wow, this is a surprise." "Julia, I need your help, it's urgent." He told her everything. The cafe, the child, the fear in the mother's eyes, the fact that he didn't even know their full names. "David," she said gently, "you know I can't open a case based on a description. You didn't witness abuse, it's delicate. If you're not careful, you could actually make things worse." "I know, but what if I do nothing and something happens?" There was a pause. Then, "Okay, I'll make some calls, quiet ones. I know a few people at downtown shelters. If they're there, someone might be able to connect." "But you didn't hear that from me." David exhaled slowly. "Thank you." He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. Meanwhile, Sarah was unraveling. Richard had found them. That single fact clung to every moment like fog. Every step outside the shelter felt like it could be her last. Every glance over her shoulder came with dread. Every unexpected sound made her flinch. She'd survived hard times. Before, cleaning offices while Lily slept in break rooms, hiding from landlords when the rent lapsed, navigating systems that saw cases, not people. But this felt different. This felt like the end of the road. She knew Richard, knew exactly what he was capable of. And now he wasn't just threatening, he was watching. And that meant he was preparing to strike. "I can't stay here," she told the shelter director, panic in her voice. But where will you go? Sarah didn't answer, because she didn't know. That night, as they curled into bed, Lily tugged at her sleeve. Mom, she whispered, do you think David is looking for us? Sarah almost laughed. Why would he? Because I asked him to help. Sarah wrapped her arms around her daughter and pulled her close, pressing her face into Lily's hair. I hope you're right, she whispered. The next afternoon, Julia called. I can't say much, she began, but there's a woman and a child at a downtown shelter who match what you described. The director said she's scared, really scared. History of abuse, immigration threats. I can't give you direct contact, but they're willing to pass along a message. David swallowed hard. Tell them I want to help. I don't want anything from them. Just, please, let me help. Julia hesitated. David, this could get messy. If she's undocumented, if he retaliates, if you get involved legally, and it's risky. Are you absolutely sure? He paused. Then quietly but firmly, I'm sure. That evening, Sarah was called into the shelter office. There's someone who wants to help, the director said. He didn't say much, only that you met him in a cafe. His name is David Caldwell. Sarah's legs nearly gave out. He said he doesn't want anything from you, the woman continued. Just wants to help. He's been looking for you since that day. Sarah sank into the chair. Her hands shook in her lap. She didn't know what this meant. Didn't know if she could trust it. If she should even try. But for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Not hope, not yet, but the faint memory of it. The knock came late in the afternoon. Sarah was in the laundry room folding a donated blanket when a shelter staff member found her. There's someone here to see you, the woman said. His name's Daniel, says he's a private investigator sent by David Caldwell. Sarah's hands froze mid-fold. She looked up, searching the woman's face for any sign of a trick, a warning, anything to prepare her for what came next. He's outside, the staff member added gently. I can stay with you if that would make you feel safer. Sarah nodded, her breath trembling as she followed her into the hallway. Daniel wasn't what she expected. He wasn't tall or intimidating. He wore a brown corduroy jacket, wire-rimmed glasses, and carried a small notepad in one hand, a thermos in the other. He looked more like a tired schoolteacher than someone hired to track dangerous men. But his voice was calm, warm, steady. Ms. Whitman, David asked me to look into your situation, only with your permission. So let me be clear, I'm not law enforcement. I don't work with immigration. I don't report anything. I just find things or people. And if you want me to, I can help. Sarah hesitated. Then she gave a single nod. Daniel flipped open his notepad. What's your daughter's name? Lily. And the man you're afraid of, Richard, full name? Richard Allen Mercer. We lived together for almost 2 years. Daniel scribbled quickly. Has he ever been arrested? Yes, once, I think, before we met. He never told me what for, just called it a misunderstanding. Daniel nodded. I'll be in touch in a few days. Sarah didn't ask how, she didn't want to know. Some things were better left unexplained. What mattered was this. Someone believed her. And that, for the first time, felt like the beginning of something. 4 days later, Daniel returned. He met Sarah in a quiet room behind the shelter kitchen, carrying a slim file that somehow felt heavier than anything she'd held in weeks. He opened it slowly and spread out the papers on the table. Here's what I found. The first page was a criminal background report. Richard Mercer. 3 prior arrests. 1 charge for domestic battery, dropped for lack of witness cooperation. Another for illegal possession of a firearm, and 1 restraining order, filed by a former girlfriend. Sarah stared at the paper like it might burn through her fingertips. There's more, Daniel said softly. Multiple noise complaints from neighbors in his building. 1 neighbor claims she saw him shove you outside 2 months ago. Sarah looked away. She remembered the night. She'd told herself no one had seen. I also found social media activity, Daniel continued. 1 burner account, it links to his phone, posts threatening messages. Things like, foreign women who lie to stay in this country. Sarah felt her heart drop. He's using your immigration status to control you, Daniel said, his tone measured but serious. That's coercion. In some contexts, it could be considered trafficking. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes. But I'm not undocumented. I'm in process. I filed everything. It's just slow. Daniel nodded. That's common. The system is built on delay. Abusers know that. They count on it. But the delay doesn't make you illegal. It makes you vulnerable. Sarah dragged her fingers through her hair. So, what can I do? Daniel leaned forward, his voice low but confident. David has offered to connect you with a legal team. Pro bono. Experts in immigration and domestic violence cases. They'll help you. Not just with forms and calls. With real protection. Sarah hesitated. What does he want in return? Daniel didn't even blink. Nothing. He said, and I quote, make sure she knows she matters, that someone cares what happens to her and that girl. For a moment, neither of them spoke. And then quietly, Sarah began to cry. Not out of fear, but from something else entirely. The shock of being seen. Meanwhile, David had received Daniel's report via encrypted email. He read every word. His jaw tightened. His chest burned. And by the time he reached the end, he pushed back from his desk and walked to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water he didn't touch. It wasn't just bad. It was far worse than he had imagined. Richard wasn't just a threat. He was calculated. Tactical. The kind of man who knew exactly how to exploit loopholes and silence. David had met men like him before, in corporate boardrooms, behind polished smiles, issuing threats in calm tones while destroying people's lives one quiet move at a time. But this wasn't business. This was different. This was personal now. He stared at the final photo in the report, a grainy image of Sarah and Lily walking down a sidewalk, and Richard trailing them, half a block behind. David felt something stir in his chest, something deep, protective, uncompromising. He had power. He had money. And for once, he had no interest in staying safe or neutral. He was going to help them completely. And if Richard ever came after them again, David was ready to burn every bridge it took to stop him. Later that evening, back at the shelter, Lily stood by the window, her chin resting on her folded hands. She watched the street like she always did, eyes tracing every car, every passerby, searching. "Do you think he's coming back?" she asked softly. Sarah didn't need to ask who she meant. She knelt down next to her daughter and said gently, "I think he already has." Lily turned to her, puzzled. "David," Sarah said softly, and for the first time in many nights, Lily smiled and fell asleep with peace in her chest. It was a Sunday like any other, or at least it started that way. The shelter carried its usual scent of disinfectant and overcooked rice, and down the hall a baby cried in slow, tired bursts. Sarah had just helped Lily with her socks when there was a knock at the dormitory door. The shelter coordinator stood outside holding a sealed envelope. "It's from the man you spoke with last week, David Caldwell. He asked me to deliver it to you personally." Sarah didn't reach for it right away. Something about the way the envelope just sat there, quiet and solid in the woman's hand, made her uneasy. When she finally took it, she turned it over a few times before sliding her finger beneath the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten, no letterhead, no official formatting, just words. "Dear Sarah, I'm writing this with care and without expectation. Please read it without fear. There's nothing here meant to pressure or obligate you in any way. Since we met, I've thought of you and Lily more times than I can count. I've thought about the fear in your voice, the quiet strength in your posture, and the way your daughter looks at you, like you're the one thing holding her whole world together. And maybe you are. What I'm about to offer may sound unconventional, but I'm asking you to consider it, and not for me, but for the peace I believe you deserve. I'd like to propose a marriage of protection. Not romance, not a fairy tale, but a legal partnership. One that would give you and Lily immediate security and protect you from Richard's threats, especially those tied to your immigration status. This isn't a favor, it's not charity, it's a choice, entirely yours. And it comes with whatever boundaries you need. If your answer is no, I will respect it completely. My offer to help doesn't change. But if your answer is yes, you'll have a home, a name on a lease, a seat at the table. Think about it. With full respect and no expectations. David." Sarah stared at the letter, her hands trembling. For a moment, everything inside her fell quiet, as if the part of her that had lived on high alert for so long didn't know what to do with an offer that didn't come with strings. Marriage? It sounded enormous, almost absurd, but also strangely not frightening. Not with him. Not after the space he had offered, the patience, the stillness. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat beside the dormitory window while Lily slept, curled up and breathing softly. Sarah read the letter again, in the dim glow of the hallway light. Her thoughts felt louder than the rustle of blankets or creaking floors. She had trusted before and been broken. Could she trust this? Could she trust him? Could she trust herself? The next morning, she asked the staff to arrange a meeting. It took 2 phone calls and a quiet agreement with the church next door. But by late afternoon, she found herself sitting in a sunlit room, lined with folding chairs and old hymnals. David arrived a few minutes later. He wore jeans and a wrinkled button-up like he hadn't slept either. His expression was calm. Not rehearsed and just real. Sarah stood as he walked in. "I read your letter," she said softly. "I figured you did," he said. "You weren't joking." "No. You're offering marriage as protection." "I'm offering a foundation," he replied. "Not a solution to everything, but maybe a way for you to breathe again." Sarah crossed her arms and walked slowly toward the window. Sunlight filtered in across the wooden floor, warm and golden. "Do you know what it's like to wake up every day wondering if a knock at the door will be the end of everything?" "No," David said. "But I know what it's like to watch someone suffer and not want to stand by anymore." Another long pause. Sarah turned to him. "If I say yes, it has to be clear. I don't want to be someone's charity. I won't be a symbol. I don't need rescuing. I want partnership. I want choice. Then that's exactly what we'll have." She studied him, searching for any flicker of ego, control, pity. There was none. Just presence, steady and sincere. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. He took a breath. "Because I think people like you deserve better, and because your daughter asked me to, and I want to honor that." Her eyes filled. Not from weakness, but from the quiet shock of being treated with dignity. She nodded slowly. "Okay," she whispered, "we'll try." Within days, the process began. David's legal team, quiet, efficient, experienced, moved quickly. They prepared the paperwork for a legal marriage and compiled documentation for Sarah's immigration case. Background checks, employment history, character references, witness statements. But no one treated her like a number. She wasn't a file, she was a person. Sarah and Lily moved into the small guest house behind David's home, a modest 2-room cottage that opened onto a garden just beginning to bloom again. Sarah insisted on clear boundaries, her own key, her own space, her own schedule. David agreed to every term without hesitation. Lily adjusted quickly. She decorated the walls with her drawings, danced barefoot in the kitchen, and sang while brushing her teeth. For the first time, she didn't flinch at raised voices or knockings at the door. Sarah, though, moved more slowly. She still double-checked the locks each night, still jumped at unexpected sounds, still kept a bag packed just in case. But something had shifted. There was light now, small but real. One evening, a week after they'd moved in, Sarah stood on the porch of the cottage staring at the main house. The windows glowed softly. Somewhere inside, David was reading or writing emails or just sitting quietly being who he was. She wasn't in love. Not yet. But she wasn't afraid anymore. And for now, that was enough. Trust wasn't something Sarah gave easily. Not anymore. Even as she unpacked boxes into the cottage behind David's house, she did it with guarded hands and watchful eyes. Every movement was careful, efficient. Placing Lily's clothes in drawers, stacking canned goods in the kitchen, double-checking the locks. It wasn't habit. It was survival. And David understood that. He kept his distance at first. Only showed up when necessary. When the immigration attorney came to review her affidavit, when Lily needed a ride to register at the local school, when the city clerk scheduled their civil marriage appointment. Each interaction was measured, respectful, polite, but never casual. And Sarah noticed. One evening, as the wind curled around the trees outside, she knocked on the back door of the main house. David answered with a mug of tea in his hand, looking surprised, but not displeased. "Hey," he said softly, "everything okay?" She nodded, stepping inside. "We need to talk." He set the mug down, of course. She sat on the edge of the sofa, posture straight, voice steady. I want to put some things in writing, non-negotiables. David sat across from her, no hesitation. All right. I need to keep my job once I'm authorized to work. I need financial independence. I'll contribute to groceries and bills. I can't lose my right to leave if I need to. You'll never lose that. I also want boundaries. Separate finances. No access to my private documents, no romantic gestures, not unless I say otherwise. David nodded. Understood, I'll have the lawyer draft it. She paused, then added, and Lily, she needs to know this isn't pretend. That what we're doing is real, even if it isn't love. It is real, David said gently. Even if it doesn't look like the kind of story you read in books. Sarah studied him long, searching. He didn't flinch, didn't try to reassure her with charm, didn't reach for her hand, and for the first time, she believed him. The weeks that followed found a rhythm. Mornings began with Lily knocking on David's door, asking if he had any extra butter for toast. Afternoons brought quiet overlaps, Sarah returning from work just as David got home from meetings. Evenings were a patchwork of separate dinners, occasional shared leftovers, and polite nods across the small garden that separated the main house from the cottage. There was no drama, no tension on the surface. But underneath there was something unspoken, a delicate tension. Not hostile, just cautious. Sarah still kept a bag packed in the closet. David still avoided asking too much. And yet something started to shift. Tiny invisible threads began to weave between them. It began with a plant. One morning Sarah found a small pot of basil on her front step, her favorite. No note, just a quiet offering. Then came the umbrella. Left hanging on her doorknob the night it rained. No knocking, no explanation, just awareness. Lily noticed too. He's nice, she said one night, brushing her teeth. Not fake nice, the real kind, the kind that doesn't try too hard. Sarah tucked her in with a faint smile. He's kind, she admitted. But that doesn't mean I stopped being careful. The marriage itself was simple. No vows, no rings. Just a few signatures in front of a notary and a quiet nod from the city clerk. David wore a plain gray jacket. Sarah wore a borrowed navy dress from the shelter. Lily held her hand the entire time. Are we a family now? She whispered as the ink dried. Sarah looked down at her and said, not the kind you read about, but maybe the kind we need. Still doubt lived inside her. Was she using him? Was she selling her name for safety? Every time she looked at David, she wondered what he really wanted. What kind of man agrees to marry a stranger? A woman with trauma, legal complications, and a child. And what did that say about her, that she said yes? One night, unable to sleep, she knocked on his door again. He was reading, as always, something old and thick and quiet. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed. Why are you doing this? He closed the book gently. Because I want to. But why me? He paused. Then, because you looked like someone who'd been told too many times that no one would come for her. And I want to be someone who did. Sarah blinked, surprised by how simple it was. How sincere. She turned to leave but paused. I'm still afraid, she admitted. You have every right to be. I don't know if I can give you anything. I'm not here to take, he said. That stayed with her. A few days later, she wrote her own kind of document. Not legal, personal. She wrote out who she was, where she came from, what she feared, what she hoped for. Her story, not polished, not perfect. She folded the pages and slipped them under David's door. No note, no explanation, just honesty. The next morning, she found a sticky note on her door. Read every word, thank you. It wasn't love. Not yet, but it was something. She hung a photo of her and Lily from a street fair, taken long before Richard. Next to it, she pinned a new picture, one Lily had drawn, of the three of them under a giant tree. At night, Sarah stopped checking the locks 3 times. Once was enough. Sometimes she didn't check at all. She began cooking more, not just food for survival, but meals that tasted like care. Sometimes she brought a plate to David, left it on his porch, knocked once, and walked away. He always returned the dish clean, sometimes with a note. Best soup I've ever had. Did you use lemon in this? Genius. You make the quiet taste like home. One night, Lily had a nightmare. Sarah found her trembling in the hallway, eyes wide with tears. Richard was here, she sobbed. He was yelling again. Sarah wrapped her arms around her, whispering, calming. But Lily shook her head. I don't want the cot, she whispered. Can I go to David's house just for a minute? Sarah hesitated, then nodded. They walked across the yard in the cold. When David opened the door, he didn't ask questions. He knelt, looked Lily in the eyes. You're safe, he said softly. No one is ever going to hurt you here, not now, not ever. Lily nodded, climbed into his oversized reading chair and fell asleep within minutes. Sarah sat nearby. She didn't say anything. Later, as she carried Lily back to the cottage, David walked beside her in silence. At the door, he paused. You're doing better than you think, he said. Sarah met his eyes. You too. By December, something like a rhythm had formed. They celebrated Lily's birthday in the backyard. Cupcakes, music, and laughter. Just the three of them. No guests, no fanfare. Just peace. David gave her a drawing set. Sarah gave her a handwritten letter about the day she was born. Lily beamed the whole day. That night, once the cottage lights dimmed and Lily was asleep, Sarah sat alone on the porch. David came by with a blanket and draped it over her shoulders without saying a word. She didn't thank him. She didn't have to. They didn't talk about the future. Not yet. Not in terms of forever. Not in terms of love. But Sarah started doing things she hadn't done in years. She left a toothbrush in the bathroom. She filled the fridge like she planned to be there next week. She watered the rosemary without needing to be reminded. And sometimes when David passed her kitchen window, she smiled. Not out of politeness, but because something inside her had finally begun to thaw. It happened on a Monday. The kind of Monday that begins in silence. Gray skies, lukewarm coffee, and a to-do list that already feels impossible. David was at his desk, reviewing contracts when the email arrived. Not from Sarah. Not from Lily's school. Not from the lawyers. The sender was the Department of Homeland Security. The subject line was blunt. Notice of marriage investigation, U.S. David stared at it for a full minute before clicking it open. The content was brief and devastating. An anonymous tip had been submitted, alleging that his marriage to Sarah Whitman was fraudulent. A sham entered into solely for immigration benefits. An audit had been triggered. A formal interview was pending. He would need to provide documentation, photos, financials, evidence of shared life, witness statements, anything that proved this marriage was real. David leaned back in his chair, stunned. Then slowly, he got angry. He didn't need to wonder who had filed the complaint. Richard. Of course it was Richard. A man like that didn't vanish. He lingered, watched, waited for stability, and then struck. David forwarded the notice to their immigration attorney and picked up his phone. Sarah answered on the second ring. I need you to come over, he said. Now, it's serious. She arrived minutes later. He handed her the printed notice. Her hands trembled as she read. He did this, she whispered. Richard. David nodded. We knew something like this could happen. But we didn't fake anything, she said, her voice rising. We didn't plan this. We didn't even know each other when... I know. Sarah looked up at him, panic creeping into her eyes. If they decide it's not real, they won't. But what if they won't? His voice was firmer now, grounded. But Sarah didn't feel reassured. Because this wasn't about truth, it was about proof. And Sarah knew better than most that truth and proof didn't always live in the same place. David looked at her, his expression steady. And he said the one thing that mattered most. We'll fight this together. What followed was a week like no other. Their lives became exhibits, evidence, timelines, photos, signatures. The attorney came to the cottage with binders and checklists and lists of required documents. You need to prove you know each other, she explained. Not just names, but details. A shared life, even if it's unconventional. Sarah folded her arms. We don't live in the same house. We don't share bank accounts. That's fine, the attorney replied. But we need to show emotional truth, consistency, a believable story. David didn't argue. He simply said, then let's start. For the next 7 days, they studied one another like students before a final exam. But the subject was themselves. David learned how Sarah took her tea. Not too hot, 1 drop of honey. Sarah learned David always read emails barefoot while making toast. They memorized birthdays, favorite books, family members. What's my worst habit? Sarah asked one night, half joking. David didn't flinch. You apologize too much. She blinked. That's not a habit. It is, he said, when you apologize just for existing. She went quiet. Later he asked him, "What's mine?" She smirked. "You vanish when you're hurt, you disappear into silence." They held each other's gaze a little longer than they meant to, then turned back to the paperwork. Lily noticed the shift. She didn't fully understand, but she could feel it. The tension in the air, the way her mother's smiles didn't last, the way David stayed up late with stacks of forms, the way the house no longer played music in the evenings. One night she tiptoed into David's office and left a folded drawing on his desk. Inside, 3 stick figures holding hands under a sun. Above them, in big, uneven letters, "We are a family." David pinned it to the front of the binder he took to every legal meeting. The investigator arrived on a Thursday. Her name was Agent Willis, professional, polite, and impossible to read. She toured the property, took photos, made notes. Then she sat down with Sarah, asked about her job, her schedule, her relationship with David. "What's something he does that annoys you?" Sarah didn't miss a beat. "He forgets to eat, works too much, and sometimes he answers questions with more questions. And what do you like about him?" Sarah hesitated. Then, "He listens. Even when I don't know what I'm trying to say." She asked David the same kinds of questions. "What did she wear the day you got married?" "A navy dress, buttons down the front." "What did she say the first time you were alone?" "She told me she didn't want a savior, just safety." Agent Willis didn't react, just nodded and wrote. Before leaving, she crouched in front of Lily. "Do you like living here?" Lily nodded shyly. "Yes." "Why?" "Because nobody yells." That was the only time the agent paused. That night the house fell into silence again. But this time it wasn't fear. It was waiting. Sarah stood at the door, locking it for the night. David handed her a mug of tea. "No, honey," he said. "Just the way you like it." She took it quiet. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "For what?" "For bringing this into your life, for being afraid." David looked at her, calm and clear. "I invited you in." She sat beside him, their shoulders close, not touching but not far. And for the first time, she didn't pull away. The official notice arrived 2 weeks after the investigator's visit. A plain envelope from the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, thin, sharp-edged, carrying more weight than its size suggested. Inside, one single sheet of paper stamped with the government seal. At the top in bold, "Notice to appear, Immigration Marriage Review Hearing." The date was set, just under a month away. Downtown Federal Building, Room 4C, 9 a.m. No questions, no negotiations, just orders. Sarah read the letter 3 times before her hands started to shake. She set it down on the kitchen table and stared at it, willing it to disappear, but it didn't. She looked out the window. The rosemary bush was still green and thriving. Lily's boots were by the door. Sunlight warmed the countertop like it always did. Everything looked normal, but none of it felt permanent. One letter could undo it all. When David came home and saw the envelope, he didn't speak at first. He read the letter quietly, then looked up and said simply, "Okay." Sarah blinked. "Okay. We'll be ready." "How can you be so sure?" He didn't hesitate. "Because I believe us." It was the simplest thing anyone had ever said to her, and the hardest to accept. The days that followed were swallowed by preparation. Their attorney handed them a list of potential interview questions. Over 50, ranging from the painfully mundane to the unexpectedly personal. "What's her favorite breakfast?" "Does he snore?" "Who takes out the trash?" "Where do you keep spare keys?" "What was your last fight about?" The questions were absurd, terrifying, the kind that reduced something sacred to paperwork and rehearsed lines, and yet they practiced. Every night after Lily went to bed, Sarah and David sat at the kitchen table, notebooks open, tea cooling by their hands, studying each other like 2 students cramming for an exam neither one had signed up for. "Middle name?" "Claire, yours is Thomas." "Which side of the bed?" "You're on the left, I'm on the right." "What's something I do that scares you?" Sarah hesitated. "You're not afraid of anything," she whispered. "That scares me." David didn't answer, but his eyes softened. Some questions were easy. Her favorite song? Songbird by Fleetwood Mac. His worst habit? He makes coffee at midnight and never finishes it. Others hit harder. What was the first gift you gave each other? They exchanged a look, shrugged. "No gifts," David said. "Nothing physical," Sarah added, "just space and safety." The attorney smiled, but it was tired. That's beautiful, but a judge needs receipts. So they gathered what they could. Photos of Lily in the garden with David, screenshots of texts, shared grocery receipts, testimonies from the shelter director, Julia the caseworker, even the barista at the cafe. And then came the mock interviews, practice sessions, feedback, coaching on posture, voice, eye contact. You can't just be truthful, the attorney warned. You have to look truthful. That's how the system works. Sarah hated it. Not because she was afraid of lying, but because she was terrified the truth wouldn't be enough. One night, after another long rehearsal, they walked the perimeter of the yard in silence. The sky was low with stars. The air was still. I feel like I'm back on trial, Sarah said quietly. Just for being alive. David stopped walking. You're not. She looked at him. Do you really think they'll see us as real? They don't have to, he said. You do. She stared at him, caught off guard by the certainty in his voice. Why do you keep standing beside me, David? He didn't look away. Because no one ever stood beside me when I needed it, he said. And I want to be what I never had. It was the closest either of them had come to anything resembling a confession. Lily could feel the shift. She stopped drawing, stopped humming, tiptoed through rooms like her footsteps might break something. One morning, Sarah found her folding laundry in the hallway. Tiny socks rolled into perfect balls. What are you doing? She asked gently. I'm helping, Lily said, so you don't worry. Sarah crouched and pulled her into her arms. You don't have to fix anything, she whispered. That's my job. But I want to help. You are helping just by being you. The night before the hearing, Sarah couldn't sleep. She sat by the cottage window staring into the quiet yard. A breeze moved through the rosemary. The air smelled like cold earth and eucalyptus. Just before midnight, there was a knock at the door. David stood there holding 2 mugs of tea. I thought maybe. She took one without speaking. They sat on the steps side by side, watching the dark shift toward morning. Do you ever wish this had all happened differently? She asked. Yes, he said, but only the pain part, not the people part. She turned her head, surprised. You and Lily, he continued. You were the unexpected I didn't know I needed. Sarah exhaled, slow, unsteady. They didn't speak again, but she stayed beside him until the sky began to glow with light. The morning of the hearing arrived wrapped in silence. No birdsong, no breeze, just the faint hum of the city stretching awake behind frosted windows. Sarah stood in front of the bathroom mirror, hands trembling as she applied a thin layer of foundation. It barely covered the fatigue beneath her eyes, but this wasn't about appearance. It was about perception. Lily sat quietly on the edge of the bed, feet dangling, her hands folded in her lap. She wore her best dress, navy blue with little white buttons. She didn't fully understand what was at stake, but she understood enough to stay still. No questions, no humming, just stillness. At exactly 8 a.m., David knocked on the cottage door. He wore a dark suit and a tie Sarah hadn't seen before. Nothing flashy, just intentional, respectful. He waited, hands in his pockets, not assuming. When Sarah opened the door, their eyes met. You ready? He asked. No, she answered. But she stepped outside anyway. The federal building was cold in all the ways that mattered. Not just in temperature, but in atmosphere. High ceilings, echoing marble, metal detectors and hushed instructions. The kind of place designed to remind you that power doesn't need to shout to control you. They passed through security and were led down a sterile corridor into room 4C, small, windowless and heavy with the scent of ink and nerves. At the far end, a raised bench, a judge, 2 government attorneys, and in the center, 2 chairs side by side. One for Sarah, one for David. Their attorney turned to them before the judge entered. Speak clearly, look her in the eye, and whatever happens, stay calm. The judge entered. Mid-50s, composed. Her voice carried the cool detachment of someone who had seen too many stories blur together. Real, false, desperate, strategic. She addressed them without emotion. Mr. Caldwell, Ms. Whitman, a complaint has been filed alleging that your marriage is fraudulent and entered into solely for immigration benefit. Do you understand the seriousness of these accusations? Yes, Your Honor, David said without hesitation. Sarah nodded, her voice wouldn't come yet. Then let's begin. David went first. The questions came in rapid succession. Dry, technical. When did you meet? Where? How long before you married? Do you share a bank account? Do you file taxes jointly? Each question seemed designed to strip away story, to reduce their lives to bullet points and yes or no answers. But David answered without flinching. Calm, focused, grounded. Not performative, just present. Then it was Sarah's turn. She had known fear before. Fear with fists, fear in cold nights and eviction notices, fear of not knowing how to feed a child. But this was different. This was institutional fear, the kind wrapped in rules and protocol and polite indifference. The judge looked directly at her. Ms. Whitman, when did you decide to marry Mr. Caldwell? Sarah swallowed. The moment I realized safety wasn't a luxury. It was a right, and I was tired of being denied it. A pause. The judge didn't react, but she didn't interrupt. Was your marriage romantic at the time? No, Sarah said. It was survival. But it was also respectful. It was the first time in my life someone saw me and didn't try to fix me or claim me. He just stood beside me. And now? Sarah took a breath. Now it's real. Not because of how it began, but because of what we've chosen every day on since. Then came the harder questions. Why no shared bank account? Why live separately? Why no honeymoon? Sarah answered, steady but honest. Because she'd lived too long being controlled. Because trauma doesn't vanish with a ceremony. Because healing takes time, and trust even more. David backed her on every word. Never over-explaining, never softening what was true. They didn't pretend it was love at first sight. They didn't try to fit a mold. They told the truth, in all its rough, careful, complicated form. Then came the witnesses. The shelter director spoke first, calm, direct. I've worked with countless women in crisis. Sarah didn't want rescue, she wanted dignity. What David offered her wasn't escape, it was stability. Then Julia, the caseworker. I've watched them build something. It's not traditional, but it's real. I've seen Sarah bring him meals. I've seen David wait outside school functions for Lily. They care, quietly, consistently. Even the cafe barista gave a statement, rambling, a little unsure but honest. She looked exhausted, like she'd been through something. Her daughter just said it straight out, please marry my mom. That's not the kind of thing you script. Then the judge looked at Lily. No one had planned for her to speak. But Lily stood up anyway. I know what a lie feels like, she said softly. Richard lied all the time, my mom doesn't. And David doesn't either. We're not pretending, we're just trying. Silence. Stillness. The judge blinked, then nodded. Thank you, Lily. And then it was over. They were asked to wait in the hallway while the judge reviewed the case. David and Sarah sat side by side on a cold bench. Lily curled up in her mother's lap, drifting toward sleep. The air felt too heavy to breathe. 37 minutes later, the door opened. Their attorney stepped out, her expression unreadable. And then the smallest smile. She approved it. Sarah froze. What? She believed you? Full review granted, no further investigation, the adjustment process moves forward. David exhaled, hard. A breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Sarah covered her face with both hands. She didn't cry. Not yet, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. David reached out and placed his hand gently over hers. Not tight, not forceful. Just there. Just enough. Presence. Time passed, and not in leaps but in inches. The hearing was behind them now, and with it, the heavy weight of uncertainty began to lift. Not all at once, but slowly. Like fog melting under early morning sun. But healing doesn't arrive with a judge's approval or a letter from an agency. It shows up quietly in between the moments no one else sees. When Sarah returned to her routines, she picked up more hours at work, helped Lily with school projects, clipped coupons, cooked. She learned to answer the phone without flinching at unfamiliar numbers. The nightmares still came, mostly on Thursdays, though she never knew why. And David gave her space. Not distance, space, a difference she hadn't known before him. He mowed the lawn on Saturdays, folded laundry she left in the dryer, left small offerings on her porch, her favorite almond milk, a book Lily had mentioned in passing, a pair of garden gloves when the rosemary bush began to bloom again. Not because he wanted anything, just because he noticed, and Sarah had learned that noticing The honest kind, the kind that doesn't ask, was a kind of love too. Then, one morning in late spring, almost 6 months after the hearing, Sarah found a letter in the mail. USC's. She opened it slowly. Inside, formal approval. Her adjustment of status had been granted. She was now a permanent resident. No more threats. No more edge-of-a-knife anxiety. No more fear that the next knock on the door would be the last. She read the letter again, and again, and again. Her hands didn't shake, but something inside her did. That evening, she knocked on David's back door. When he opened it, she didn't speak. She just handed him the letter. He read it, brows lifting slightly, then nodded. "Congratulations," he said gently. "Thank you." A pause. She looked at him, really looked. "Would you come by the cottage later?" she asked. "Just me. Lily's staying at a friend's tonight." David hesitated only for a second, then nodded. Of course. Later that night, he knocked softly. She opened the door barefoot, wearing a soft gray sweater and jeans. No makeup, hair pulled back. There was something different in her face. Not lighter, not brighter, just clear. "I've been carrying something," she said, motioning to the table. He sat. Sarah pulled a small envelope from a shelf and set it in front of him. Inside, divorce papers. Signed, finalized, processed weeks earlier. "I had them drawn up right after the hearing," she said quietly. "I needed a way out, just in case, and you never asked." David nodded slowly. "I figured." "You're not surprised?" "No," he said. "I thought you'd want that control." "I did," she admitted, then looked at him. "I'm not sure I do anymore." She sat beside him, folded her hands. "I've been thinking about the difference between needing protection and wanting partnership, between surviving and choosing." She reached across the table and slid a second envelope toward him. Smaller, lighter. Inside, a new marriage application. Blank, unfiled, unforced. "I want to do it again," she said softly. But this time, not for documents, not for fear, not even for Lily. David looked down at the form, then up at her. His expression didn't change much, just softened. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I am." "And if I say yes?" "Then we build it slow, no pressure, no pretending, just truth and time." David reached for her hand, and this time she didn't pull away. The wedding happened 6 months later, not in a courthouse, not in fear, but in the backyard beneath the rosemary bush Lily had helped plant. Only a few people came. Julia, the shelter director, a few new friends, and a smiling judge who said little but meant every word. Sarah wore a simple white dress, no veil, no heels. David wore the same tie he'd worn to the first hearing. Lily handed them the rings. "I now pronounce you," the judge began. But Sarah smiled and gently interrupted. "We already chose each other, this is just catching up." Everyone laughed, and David, for once, didn't hide his joy. That night, after the guests had gone and the lights were dimmed, Sarah stood barefoot in the kitchen watching David make tea. Same way he always had. Same quiet hands, same steady grace. "You know," she said softly, "I almost didn't ask." "Why did you?" "Because you never asked me to." He paused, then smiled. "That's why I waited." She stepped closer, wrapped her arms around his waist. "I'm glad you did." Outside, Lily danced in the dark with sparklers in both hands. And for the first time in years, Sarah didn't brace for what might come next. Because for once, she was exactly where she wanted to be. This wasn't a story about a perfect couple. It was about two people who met in the aftermath. Not to rescue each other, but to walk side by side in a world that had, too many times, told them to walk alone. Sarah didn't need a savior. David wasn't looking for a fairy tale ending. What they built wasn't magical. It was intentional, rooted in trust, grown through time, chosen again and again, even when it was hard. And maybe that's the kind of love this world needs more of. How many people pass you by each day, carrying stories you'll never know? And what if, just once, you stop to listen? If this story moved you, please leave a like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell me, where in the world are you watching from? Your support is what keeps this channel alive.